I have kept the accounts of Harwick Hall for 11 years. I have recorded harvests and losses, births in the tenant cottages and deaths in the family chapel, the rise and ruin of debts, the quiet weather of the Duke's moods across the long table at dinner. I am a man of ledgers. I note what happens. I do not editorialize. The discipline has served me well across 3 decades of service to 2 different great houses, and I have never found cause to abandon it. But I will tell you what I saw in the spring of 1847, because it deserves a proper record, and because I was the only one in that house who watched all of it from beginning to end without looking away. When the thing was finished, when the accounts were balanced as they always must be, I found I could not leave it out of the ledger. Some entries belong in the official record. Others belong in the kind of record that a man keeps for himself, in the hours after the house is quiet, when the fire is low and the ink is honest. This is that kind of entry. The orchards began failing in October of 1846. Not dramatically. The rot does not announce itself in Gloucestershire. It simply arrives, the way grief does, quietly and then everywhere at once. By November, the apple canopy along the south ridge had gone gray, the bark thinning in the way that signals something working beneath the surface. By January, 3 of the 8 pear rows were stripped bare by a fungal spread none of the men could name with confidence, though several named it with great confidence and were wrong. By February, the cattle in the lower field had been moved twice because the pasture drainage was failing, and the yield projections for the coming year were, when I put them plainly to the Duke, alarming. Aldous Vane, the Duke of Harwick, was not a man who showed alarm. He received the projections, read them twice, set them on the desk, and looked out the library window at the February gray for approximately 2 minutes. Then he called in the experts. The first, from London, arrived in December and spent 3 days in the orchards, with a great deal of equipment and confidence. His report, submitted in January, ran to 19 pages, and concluded that the cause was likely airborne fungal contamination from the neighboring estate's waste management practices, which was plausible enough to sound authoritative and wrong enough to be useless. The second expert, from Bristol, came in early January, disagreed with the first in language that was barely professional, and proposed a chemical treatment that Potts, the head under-gardener, a man of 20 years Harwick experience, told me quietly would strip the root systems of anything worth saving within 2 growing seasons. I passed this opinion to the Duke without attribution. He had the second expert's proposal filed under inadvisable, and the man sent back to Bristol. The third and fourth experts came together in late January, which was either efficiency or a sign that they lacked confidence in their individual diagnoses, and delivered a joint report that disagreed with both previous reports, agreed with each other in only the broadest terms, and recommended a drainage survey without specifying what the survey should look for. The fifth man, a professor of established reputation from Edinburgh, who arrived in the first week of February with a trunk of instruments and an assistant who took notes in a leather-bound journal, spent 4 days in the south field, 2 days in the orchard rows, and 1 day in my office examining 12 years of estate records. He charged a fee that made me revise the quarterly figures when I recorded it. His report was 37 pages long. It said, in essence, that the cause was unknown, the prognosis uncertain, and that further study was warranted. The Duke read the Edinburgh report on a Tuesday evening. He stood at the library window for longer than 2 minutes this time. The fire had burned low by the time he spoke. "There is a woman," he said. I waited. With Aldous Vane, the interval between a statement and its elaboration was not a silence to fill. It was a working interval, the way the pause between a question and its answer is not emptiness but the sound of thought. "Hale," he said, still at the window, his back to the room. "Her name is Ashwell. Her father was Dr. Robert Ashwell, a botanist, plant pathologist specifically. His methodology was considered unconventional in the formal circles, which is the word those circles use when they mean someone is doing something they cannot follow. He died last autumn. His daughter has continued his correspondence, his records, his line of inquiry. She has been in London this season attempting to establish a consulting practice and has been, from what I understand, laughed out of 3 separate consulting rooms, not because her work was questioned, but because she is his daughter rather than his son. He paused. She is 24 years old. She has been working in the field since she was 14. She has published 2 papers under her father's name because no journal would take them under her own. Another pause. I want her here. I said nothing for a moment, because the moment required thought before words. The cost of this invitation was not primarily financial, though Miss Ashwell's fee, whatever it would be, would require careful placement in the quarterly accounts. The cost was social, and social costs at the level of a duke are never small. Aldous Vane had a reputation built across 42 years of deliberate precision. A man who did not explain himself, who was feared across 3 counties for the economy of his judgments, the directness of his refusals, and the particular quality of his silences that communicated more than most men's speeches. He had never been laughed at. He had been feared, respected, occasionally resented, and I suspected, privately admired by people who would not admit it. To invite a woman, a botanist's unmarried daughter, of no particular family standing, whose professional credentials had been rejected in London, to diagnose the failure of a great estate's orchards, after 5 male experts of established reputation had already failed, was the kind of thing that would reach London drawing rooms by the end of the month. It would be dissected with great pleasure and no accuracy. She will be here by Thursday, the Duke said, and that was that. He turned from the window, and the matter was closed in the way Harwick Hall matters are closed when he has decided. I wrote the letter that evening. She arrived on a Thursday morning in a hired coach, which told me something about her finances, and she stepped down from it into the gray Gloucestershire drizzle with no sign of either anxiety or performance. She had 1 trunk and a leather case of the kind that physicians carry, worn at the corners and initialed in faded gold, R.A. her father's. She carried it herself when the footman moved to take it, a gesture not of rudeness but of habit, the habit of a woman who had learned not to wait for assistance that was offered and then withdrawn. She was a young woman of medium height, with brown hair pinned efficiently under a dark bonnet, and a face that was serious in the way that serious faces are serious. Not grim, not unhappy, but occupied. She wore a dark wool traveling dress of good quality and considerable age, the quality of a family that had once had more than it presently did, which is a different quality from new poverty, and carries its own kind of dignity. Her hands, when she removed her gloves to shake mine, were not the hands of a woman who spent her hours in drawing rooms. They were capable hands, lightly calloused at the fingertips, with a small scar on the left index finger that looked like the mark of a pruning knife. "Miss Ashwell," I said, "I am Edmund Hale, the estate steward. Welcome to Harwick Hall." She looked at me with gray eyes of the measuring variety, the kind that assess rather than merely observe. "Mr. Hale, I would like to see the affected trees before I see the house, if that is convenient." It was not entirely convenient. I had arranged for the Duke to receive her in the library at 11. It was 9:30. I considered this for approximately 3 seconds. "Of course," I said, "this way." We went to the south orchard directly. She did not speak as we walked through the gate and into the first row of apple trees, which I found, after a moment's instinctive discomfort, oddly restful. Most people, and I have shown a considerable number of experts around Harwick in the past 3 months, fill silence with the sound of their own forming conclusions. Miss Ashwell filled it with looking. She walked slowly, with her head moving in small, deliberate arcs, and she stopped entirely at the 3rd tree in the first row without warning, crouched down in the mud beside its base, and removed her gloves. I watched her press her bare fingertips into the bark at the site of the primary canker. She pressed not tentatively, but with the confidence of someone who knows what information her fingers are capable of gathering. Then she leaned forward and smelled the wood. I maintained my professional expression with the practice of 11 years. She leaned back on her heels, still crouched, and looked along the length of the row. Her eyes moved with a particular quality of attention, not dramatic, not the performed concentration of a man hoping to be seen thinking, but a genuine, interior absorption, as if the world had narrowed to the diameter of one gray-barked apple tree, and she was content to be inside it until she had what she needed. "How deep does the infected area run into the third row?" she asked, without looking up. "The cankers extend across 6 trees on each side, as far as we can judge visually. And the drainage channels along the east wall." She stood now, pulling her gloves back on. "When were they last cleared?" "I thought the autumn before last, I believe. Potts would have the exact record." She nodded slowly, looking at the canopy. The February apple trees were bare, the gray sky visible through the branching in a way that made the dead sections obvious by their particular stillness. The stillness of wood that had stopped being wood and begun being something else. "I will want to see the conservatory glasshouses," she said. "The east drainage channels in person. The well water, I need a sample taken before any rain falls. And I need the estate accounts for the last 4 years, specifically the drainage maintenance records and any records of lime or chalk application to the south field." "The accounts are in my office," I said. "I can have the relevant sections prepared for you this afternoon. And I would like to speak with your head undergardener if he is willing." She glanced at me. "Not to supplant his knowledge, to understand what he has observed. He will have seen things in 20 years that no expert's visit will have covered." This was, I thought, a perceptive instinct. I told her that Potts would meet her in the conservatory that afternoon and that he would be, if not warm, at least present, which with Potts was the working approximation of welcome. She nodded and walked to the next tree. She met the Duke at 11, as I had arranged, in the library. I took my customary position near the east bookshelf, visible and quiet. Aldous Vane rose when she entered, which was correct form, and waited while I made the introduction, which she received with a small nod and no particular deference. She sat in the indicated chair, settled the leather case beside her feet, and looked at the Duke with the same gray assessing attention she had given the apple trees in the south row. I had the brief, private thought that she was the first person in recent memory who had looked at Aldous Vane without any element of performance, without the slight adjustment that most people make when they are being looked at by a man of that particular quality of power. She looked at him as she would look at anything she was trying to understand accurately. He looked back with a stillness that, in another man, I might have read as coldness, but that I had learned to read as the stillness of a man giving his full attention to something. "Your Grace," she said, "I have seen the South Orchard. With Mr. Hale's assistance, I have also walked the east drainage channel and observed the conservatory glasshouses, though briefly. I have a preliminary view, though I want to be clear that it is preliminary, and I will not commit it to writing until I have 3 more days of testing." "Your preliminary view," the Duke said. She did not rush the answer. "The orchard failure is almost certainly a secondary consequence rather than a primary infection. The 5 reports you have received treat it as primary, as a fungal event originating in the canopy or the surface soil, requiring surface treatment. I believe they are looking in the wrong direction. The root system chemistry has been altered. The trees are not fighting an infection so much as they have lost the capacity to resist one, because something foundational has been disrupted." She paused. "My working hypothesis, to be tested over the next 3 days, is that a drainage collapse in the east wall, I saw cracking in the channel bed that suggests it may have occurred 2 or 3 years ago, has shifted the water table under the south field. This has acidified the root zone soil beyond the tree's tolerance range, which has suppressed their natural fungal resistance, and what you are seeing in the canopy is opportunistic consequence. Surface treatment will not fix it. The correct remediation is drainage restoration, targeted soil correction, and a root treatment I can specify. If you act quickly, the spread should arrest within a single growing season. The Duke was very still. If you act quickly, he repeated. Spring is the correct time. If you wait until summer, you lose the window. She was precise and not apologetic about it. The Edinburgh report recommended further study. I understand why the cause is not obvious from surface observation, but further study in this case costs you a season. A silence. The fire moved in the grate. And the conservatory, the Duke said. His voice was the same. It cost him something. I heard the faint calibration of it, the way a man keeps his voice level on ground that is not entirely level for him. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression registered that this was a different question from the orchard question, that the stakes of it were different in kind. She was perceptive, Miss Ashwell. That is a separate problem, she said quietly, and I believe a considerably more fixable one. She did not pause to soften it further. Your head gardener has been maintaining the orchids under the assumption that the glasshouse holds a consistent temperature and humidity. It does not. There is a gap in the northwest panel. The frame has shifted. I think in the last 18 months or so, that creates a cold draft in the early morning hours. The orchids are not diseased. They are not failing due to any deficiency in their care. They are cold-shocked repeatedly at the hour before the household wakes when no one is present to observe it. Seal the panel, adjust the morning watering to account for the temperature correction, and allow 6 weeks. She met his gaze. The large specimens on the south bench are stressed. They are not dead. They are recoverable if you act now. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing. I had seen him receive news of estate losses, legal complications, the death of his mother, all of it in the same quality of stillness. But the stillness he held now was different in a way I noted without being able to articulate precisely. You will have everything you require, he said at last. 3 days or however many you need. Speak with Hale for anything the estate can provide. She nodded, stood, and took up her case. At the door she paused, almost an afterthought. The drainage tests will require samples taken at 3-day intervals to be reliable. I should tell you now, so that you can adjust your expectations about the length of the engagement. He looked at her steadily. Miss Ashwell, he said, take whatever time the work requires. She left. I looked at the Duke. He was looking at the closed door with an expression I had not catalogued before in 11 years of observation. I turned to my ledger and recorded the initial terms of the consultation agreement, and I added nothing else. She worked from first light each morning. This was not performed industry. She was not a woman who needed to be seen working. She was simply a woman for whom the work was, in the most fundamental sense, the point, and who therefore began it at first light because first light was when it was possible to begin. I watched the household adjust to her within the first 48 hours. The cook, a woman of strong domestic convictions who had initially received the news of a female consultant, with the particular silence that means strong feelings carefully restrained, began leaving a covered plate in the kitchen by 12:30, because Miss Ashwell had missed luncheon twice, and it was clear she would continue to miss it unless the meal came to her. The 2 housemaids who serviced the east wing, where her room was, reported, with something between bafflement and approval, that she made her own bed each morning before they arrived, and kept her belongings in an order that suggested military training or a very early learned self-reliance. The footman, who had been uncertain how to address her in the early hours when she appeared at the back door with mudded boots and her father's leather case, settled within 3 days on Miss Ashwell, delivered with the same respectful brevity they used for the family solicitor. Potts was the more interesting case. He had worked the Harrowitz grounds for 22 years. He was a man of considerable knowledge and considerable pride in that knowledge, and he had watched the 5 previous experts move through his orchards and his conservatory with the particular expression of a craftsman watching amateurs handle his tools. He had answered their questions with scrupulous accuracy and volunteered nothing, because he had observed, across 22 years, that volunteering information to experts who had already decided their conclusions was a waste of time that cost him nothing to withhold. He met Miss Ashwell in the conservatory on the first afternoon, as I had arranged. I stayed near the door on the pretense of reviewing a planting record. She did not begin by asking questions. She walked the length of the conservatory first, slowly, with the same quality of attention she gave the orchard, looking at each bench of specimens in turn, pausing at several, bending to look at the base of stems, checking the moisture of the growing medium with her fingers. Then she walked back to where Potts was standing with his arms folded and his expression composed into neutrality. "You water in the evenings," she said. It was not a question. He unfolded his arms slightly. "That's right." "Who established the evening schedule?" A pause. "The late Duchess. Her Grace preferred the evening round because the light was better for checking the blooms." He said it carefully, neutrally, the way one says things about the dead to strangers. "How long ago did the blooms begin to fail?" Potts looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "About 2 years after Her Grace passed." He said it simply, without extra weight, just the fact of it delivered plainly. "So the schedule has been maintained for 3 years by habit and in her memory, but the conditions that made it correct have changed." She said it without judgment, as a man might say the road has washed out. The evening watering was correct when the glasshouse held its temperature overnight, but there is a gap in the northwest panel. I found it this morning. It creates a cold event in the early hours. The plants are taking up water in the evening and being cold shocked before dawn, when the water in the growing medium has not fully processed. It is not the schedule's fault. It is a structural change that made a correct schedule incorrect. Potts was looking at her with an expression I had not seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man who has been doing something for 3 years with a growing private suspicion that something was wrong, and who has just been told, precisely, and without blame, what it was. "The gap," he said slowly. "Northwest panel, 3rd section from the wall. You can feel the temperature differential with your hand if you press it flat to the glass in the morning before the house wakes. I will show you exactly where." "I checked those panels," he said, not defensively, more the way a man checks his own memory. The shift would have been gradual. A millimeter or 2 a season as the frame settled. It would not have been visible in a standard inspection. She looked at him. "The frame is original to the glass house." 1812, he said. "Then the joint compression is the issue, not the fitting. It was done correctly. It has simply moved." She paused. "I would recommend putty for the seal, not caulk. The caulk will crack in the temperature variance by next winter. Putty will hold." Potts looked at the northwest panel for a long moment. Then he looked back at her. "When do you want to go up?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Before the house wakes." He nodded slowly, with the gravity of a man accepting a correct order from a competent source, which in 22 years I had seen him extend to approximately 4 people at Harrowick, including the late Duchess and the Duke himself. "I'll have the stepladder ready," he said. The stepladder was ready at 6:30 the following morning. I know because I was in the conservatory at 6:30, which is not my usual hour. Having told myself I was there to check on the early drainage sample collection, and believing myself approximately half. She was on the ladder at the northwest panel, with Potts standing below holding the base. She had her palm flat against the glass in the 3rd section, and even from across the conservatory, I could see the slight change in her expression that means a hypothesis confirmed. "Here," she said, "and the secondary gap is here about 4 inches left, Hold your hand between them." Potts reached up and held his hand between the 2 points she indicated. He stood like that for a long moment. The conservatory was very quiet in the early light. "I can feel it," he said. "Yes." She came down from the ladder. They stood looking at the panel together, 2 people in the early morning light of a glass house that had been failing for 3 years, who had just found the thing. 22 years I've worked this house," he said quietly. It was not an excuse. It was the sound of a man taking an accounting. "The gap opened gradually," she said. "You were maintaining the correct practice. The structure changed without announcing itself. That is not a failure of observation, it is a failure of the frame." She picked up her case. "Putty in the joint today if you can. I would like to test the temperature read tomorrow morning before I write it into the report." Potts nodded. "I'll do it this morning," he said, "before noon." She looked at him for a moment, a direct, level look. "Thank you," she said, "for working with me." He met her eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for knowing where to look." I went to examine the drainage samples on the east side, which was what I had told myself I was there for, and I kept my face very neutral as I passed them. That evening I found the Duke in the conservatory. This was not unusual. He came to the conservatory in the evenings, particularly in the hours after dinner when the house was quiet. He came, as far as I had ever been able to observe, simply to be near his mother's things. He never tended the plants, that was Potts's domain, and he never brought work with him. He simply stood at the long south bench, where the Cattleya specimens were arranged in their clay pots, with the ivory labels in his mother's handwriting, and he stood there for whatever time he needed, and then he left. I had never commented on this, and did not intend to. He was at the south bench when I came in to retrieve the evening drainage record. He turned when he heard me. "The panel gap," he said. "Potts sealed it this afternoon." "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Ashwell wants to record the temperature differential tomorrow morning before she finalizes the conservatory section of her report." He looked back at the orchids. The large Cattleya along the south bench were pale, their leaves still and slightly yellowed at the edges, but I had looked at them closely that morning, and I had seen what Miss Ashwell had told me to look for. At the base of 2 or 3 stems, the faint green of new growth beginning, fragile and precise. "She found it on the 3rd day," the Duke said. "The first 5 men were here for a combined total of nearly 2 weeks. The Edinburgh professor was here for 7 days. She found the gap on the 1st morning," I said. "She confirmed it on the 3rd. She did not report it until she was certain." He was quiet for a moment. "She did not report it until she was certain," he repeated, as if this particular quality of precision was worth examining from multiple angles. "No," I said, "she did not." He looked at the orchids for another long moment. "She told me they are recoverable," he said. "My mother's Cattleya, the large ones. She is confident in it. She does not appear to be a woman who says things she is not confident in." "No," I said. "She does not appear to be." He reached out and touched one of the ivory labels with the tip of one finger, the label of the largest Cattleya on the bench, the one his mother had grown from a cutting taken from her own mother's collection, a line of custody that went back 50 years. The label read Cattleya labiata in the late Duchess's careful hand, with a date, 1821, and a small notation I could not read from where I stood. "She would have liked to have known someone like Miss Ashwell," he said. He said it quietly and simply to the orchid rather than to me. "My mother, she would have found her interesting, in the way she found very few people interesting." I said, "I imagine Miss Ashwell would have found her interesting in return, Your Grace." The treatment records from the original establishment of this collection are quite detailed. Miss Ashwell spent an hour with them yesterday. He looked at me then. The particular quality of his attention, turned on me, was something I had never become entirely accustomed to in 11 years. "She read the original records." "Yes, She said it helped her understand the baseline conditions the collection was established under. He looked back at the orchids. They are the same conditions she is trying to restore, he said slowly. The original baseline. Yes, I said. That is, I believe, precisely the point. He was quiet for a long time. I retrieved the drainage record, found my excuse to leave, and did so. London found out on the 14th of February. The mechanism was Lady Renshaw, a woman of considerable social energy and very little restraint, who had encountered the Duke at a Cheltenham gathering in January and had subsequently written to her sister in Mayfair with the information that Harwick Hall had called in a woman to assess the orchards. Her sister had told the story at a dinner on Valentine's evening, and from there it distributed itself with the efficiency that only London gossip achieves when the material is considered sufficiently unusual. By the time the version reached us, it had been improved. The Duke had lost all his money. He had tried 6 experts and all had refused the case. He had been forced, out of desperation, to hire a woman, specifically the daughter of that odd botanist who had never had proper academic standing, a woman who had been laughed out of every proper establishment in the city. One embellishment, added somewhere between the Mayfair dinner and the account that reached me through the estate's London correspondence, was that Miss Ashwell was quite peculiar, possibly unwell. I found this version particularly irritating, as the published papers attributed to Dr. Robert Ashwell, which I had, in the days following her arrival, obtained and read in the evenings, were methodologically sound and analytically precise, and the methodology was recognizably his daughter's. The Duke received this intelligence by way of a letter from his cousin Bertram, who had included it with the evident intention of being helpful and the effect of being annoying. He read it at breakfast, set it beside his coffee cup, and finished his toast. "Are the secondary drainage samples ready for Miss Ashwell's afternoon analysis?" he said. "Yes, Your Grace. Potts collected them this morning." "Good. She will want the east field elevation measurements as well, I think. The gradient question is not yet resolved in the report." "I will see to it." He folded his cousin's letter and placed it at the edge of the table in the way that means it will be dealt with eventually, and is not interesting enough to be dealt with now, and returned to his coffee. And that was the entirety of his engagement with London's opinion of his management decisions, and I admired it as a piece of professional self-possession that I aspired to replicate in my own sphere. On the 16th day of her engagement, Miss Ashwell delivered the written report. It ran to 41 pages. It was organized into 4 sections: the orchard diagnosis, the remediation plan with timeline and cost estimates, the conservatory diagnosis and treatment protocol, and a concluding section on long-term drainage management for the South Field. And it was the most clearly reasoned technical document I had read in 11 years of managing estate consultancy reports. I read it the evening before the Duke received it. This was not irregular. My review of incoming technical documents was standard practice, but I found myself reading it twice, which was not standard, and making notes in the margin of my own copy, which was also not standard. The Duke received it the following morning, read it over the course of the day, and met with Miss Ashwell that afternoon in the library. I was not present for that meeting. The Duke conducted it without me, which was unusual but within his prerogative, and I did not ask about its substance. What I observed, when Miss Ashwell came out of the library an hour later, was that she had the expression of a person who has been taken seriously in the precise specific way that they have wanted to be taken seriously, and have not, until recently, been. It was a contained expression. She would not have described herself as moved by the meeting. But I had learned to read her face in 16 days, and I noted it. The drainage restoration began the following week. 4 men from the estate farm crew were assigned to the project under her direction. She worked alongside them, not as an overseer standing at a distance, but in the ditch with her sleeves pinned back, measuring gradient and checking soil samples, and explaining to each man what they were looking for and why. The farm crew, who had initially received her direction with the particular wariness of men being managed by someone outside their understanding of the proper management structure, adjusted within 2 days. By the end of the first week, one of them, a young man named Croft who had been on the estate for 3 years and had opinions about everything, was asking her questions that were not about the immediate task, but about the underlying soil science, and she was answering them in the same direct, unpatronizing register she applied to everything. And I observed this from the south field gate on my afternoon inspection rounds, with the feeling of a man who is watching something that is going correctly. The London party arrived on the 22nd of March. I want to record, for accuracy, that the invitation had been issued in January, before Miss Ashwell's engagement began. It was a semi-annual obligation, a gathering of 8 or 9 neighboring families and London acquaintances, the kind of thing the Duke hosted twice a year without enthusiasm, and endured with the economy of a man who has decided that the minimum required by his station is the quantity he will provide. The invitation could not be recalled without generating the precise kind of comment the Duke wished to avoid generating. The guests arrived over the course of 2 days. Lord and Lady Renshaw from the neighboring estate, the lady who had distributed the story to London, arriving with the cheerful confidence of a woman who had done nothing she considered wrong. The Honorable Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright from London, he a man of the city with the city's particular brand of frank insensitivity, she a quiet woman who observed more than she contributed. Lady Dunmore and her unmarried daughter, a pretty, well-meaning girl named Caroline who had no cruelty in her, and a very clear understanding of the social mathematics of any room she entered. 3 others of less importance. Miss Ashwell's engagement, by this point, had extended significantly beyond its original 3-day scope. The drainage restoration was ongoing. The conservatory treatment protocol required monitoring. There was, additionally, the unfinished business of the East Field gradient analysis, which had opened a secondary question about the long-term soil management of the lower pasture that she had, characteristically, declined to leave incompletely addressed. She was still in the house. She dined each evening. The arriving guests would encounter her at the table, which placed her in the social arithmetic that I had privately been anticipating with some concern. At dinner on the first evening, the 22nd, the guests assembled at the long table in the full candlelight of the dining room, which Harwick does properly. The silver, the flowers, the arranged place settings. Miss Ashwell was placed toward the middle of the table, in the position I had given her, which was correct for her standing without being either dismissive or conspicuous. She wore the dark green dress she appeared to have brought for evening occasions, not new, but well made, and a color that suited her in a way I did not particularly analyze because it was not relevant to my professional function. Lady Renshaw established the tone within the first remove. She had the talent for it that some women develop who have spent 30 years as the most important person in the room and have mistaken the experience for skill. "How interesting," she said, with a warmth that was its own category of warmth, social-grade warmth, the kind that means nothing in particular and costs nothing to produce. "That you have found a use for the botanist's daughter. A kind of estate management, is it? One does read of such arrangements, women with rather specialized knowledge, taken on in an advisory capacity. Very forward-thinking." Miss Ashwell set her spoon down with no drama. "It is a consulting engagement, Lady Renshaw," she said pleasantly. "Plant pathology and drainage remediation. The 2 problems are connected, as it turns out." "Quite," said Lady Renshaw, with a smile that absorbed this without changing shape. Mr. Cartwright, who had been listening with genuine curiosity and no sensitivity, looked up from his plate. "Didn't know women went in for that sort of thing. Soil analysis, the technical end of it." He said it without malice, which is its own variety of difficult. "Bit of a departure from the usual, isn't it? What's the appeal for a young woman?" The table waited. I watched Miss Ashwell. She looked at Mr. Cartwright with the level gray attention she gave everything. "The appeal, Mr. Cartwright, is the same appeal the field held for Nehemiah Grew, for Robert Hooke, for Erasmus Darwin, and for my father," she said. "The appeal of understanding why something is dying and being able to stop it. I am not certain why the appeal would differ according to the sex of the person who holds it. The plants are dying regardless." A brief silence. Mr. Cartwright blinked, not unkindly, with the genuine blankness of a man who has received an answer that does not fit the shape of his question. "Quite right," he said, and returned to his dinner. I looked at the Duke. He was looking at her, not at the exchange, at her. He was not looking in the way a man looks when a woman has performed cleverness for the room's entertainment. There was none of the watching a trick quality, the amused detachment of the observer. He was looking at her with a focused, unhurried attention, the kind he gave to things that interested him in the most fundamental sense, the kind he had given to the Edinburgh report before concluding it was useless, and to the original drainage records, and to his mother's Cattleya label on the night he had touched it. He was looking at her as the person at the table who was, in his private accounting, the most worth looking at, and he was not particularly concerned with concealing this from himself. He glanced up, caught me watching, and looked back at his dinner. I did the same. We did not discuss it. On the 25th of March, the northwest panel sealant finished its setting period, and the first watering trial under the corrected morning schedule was completed. Potts sent a note to Miss Ashwell before the household had fully risen, brought by the youngest footman with the earnestness of a man delivering important dispatches. She received it at the breakfast table, read it, and set it beside her teacup with an expression of quiet satisfaction, not triumphant, not performative. The expression of a person who has done careful work and seen it land where it was aimed. That afternoon she was in the conservatory when the Duke came in. I know this because I was in the doorway behind him. I had come to retrieve a planting record I had left on the potting table. I stayed in the doorway. She was at the south bench with one of his mother's Cattleya, the large one on the end, the original cutting that went back 50 years. She had it turned in the afternoon light, examining the base of the stem with the small hand lens that lived on the bench, his mother's lens, worn smooth at the grip. She had not asked to use it. It had been there, and she had taken it up, and it was the correct tool for the examination, and those were the only considerations that had applied. She did not hear him come in. He stopped a few feet behind her, watching her hold his mother's lens, watching her use his mother's method on his mother's plant in his mother's glasshouse, and his face was doing something I had no entry for in 11 years of observation. "She kept the notes in Latin," he said quietly. "My mother, the plant labels." She turned. She was not startled. She had the composure of a woman who had spent her life in rooms where she was unexpected and had developed the reflex. She looked at the lens in her hand, then at him. "I borrowed it," she said. "I should have asked." "She would have given it to you," he said. The simplicity of it was complete, not a social formula, a statement of something he knew. He looked at the orchid she was holding. "Is it recovering?" "Yes." She turned the plant in the light without hesitation. "Look at the base of the stem. Do you see the new growth? That green there at the base of the secondary shoot. That began within 48 hours of sealing the panel." He came to stand beside her, and they were close, two people looking together at a small point of new green at the base of a recovering orchid in the afternoon light of his mother's glasshouse. The Cattleya are resilient. They are inclined to live. They only needed the cold to stop. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the new growth she had pointed to. "She grew these from cuttings," he said. "Over 30 years. She brought the first one from her mother's collection when she came to Harrowick as a bride. She kept the record of each one. The labels are still there." Miss Ashwell looked along the bench at the row of ivory labels in the late Duchess's careful hand. Every one, with the date and the source notation. She was thorough. He reached out and took the label of the plant she was holding, reading his mother's handwriting. He held it for a moment. She was, he said. He said it as a man says a thing he knows with the whole length of him. Miss Ashwell looked at him with the direct, precise attention she gave things she was trying to understand. The original treatment records from the establishment of this collection, she said, carefully. I read through them when I was working on the conservatory diagnosis. The methodology was very consistent. She understood the principles of what she was maintaining, not just the practice. She had worked it out for herself. She had no formal training, he said. She taught herself. From her mother's practice and from correspondence with the botanical societies, they would not admit her as a member, but they answered her letters. A pause. She found it amusing, I think, is not the right word. She found it characteristically human, she used to say, that the letters of a woman who was right should be less welcome than the letters of a man who was wrong. Miss Ashwell said nothing for a moment. Then, she was right about the cattleya. The method is correct for these specimens. I changed the watering schedule, but the underlying treatment logic, hers is right. He set the label back. He looked at her face, at the lens she was holding, at the plant between them. She would have liked you, he said. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without adornment or social calculation, a fact he was stating. She did not like very many people. The ones she liked were the ones who were precise and honest and not concerned with being observed being those things. He paused. You remind me of her in that. Miss Ashwell looked at the orchid. A small change moved across her face, not quite seen, the way a change in light is not quite seen but is clearly felt. I would have very much liked to meet her, she said quietly. Her letters to the societies, do you have them? Yes, he said after a moment. In the library, in her correspondence box. If you were ever willing to show them, I am not asking as part of the consultation. Only I would find it interesting. He looked at her. Something in his expression had moved in the way that a room changes quality when a window is opened, not dramatically, but completely. Tomorrow morning, he said, before your field work, come to the library. She nodded. Then she turned the cattleya back in the light, checking the secondary growth one more time, and set it carefully back in its position on the bench. They stood in the quiet glasshouse in the afternoon light for a moment, side by side, not speaking, and I backed out of the doorway with the planting record I had not collected, because it was not the moment to collect it, and walked back to my office in the long corridor with the feeling of a man who has seen the entry in a ledger that explains all the previous ones, and who understands, finally, how the accounts are going to balance. The evening of the 27th brought the thing to its necessary conclusion. The dinner was full. All the guests assembled in the dining room, the candles lit, the conversation at the volume it reaches when a gathering has settled into itself. The drainage restoration had, that afternoon, received its first confirmation. Croft had found the corrected gradient holding perfectly at the site of the original channel failure, and the soil sample taken that morning showed the first measurable correction in the pH reading of the root zone. It was not proof, yet proof would come over the growing season, but it was the first data point that pointed unambiguously in the right direction. I had told the Duke at 5 o'clock. He had read the figures, set them down, and said, "Inform Miss Ashwell." I had. She had received the news in the conservatory, where she was making her evening check of the cattleya under the corrected watering schedule. She had read the figures, nodded once, and said, "Good. We need 3 more consistent readings before I will update the report's projection." That was the whole of her response, and it was, in its way, the most reliable confirmation of her competence I had observed in 5 weeks. A person who receives good news about their own work with the same precision they bring to everything else, and who does not permit good news to become a substitute for the full evidence. Lady Dunmore's daughter, Caroline, was speaking to Mrs. Cartwright across the table in the particular low voice that carries in a dining room without intending to. She was a kind-hearted girl, and she meant nothing by it, I want to record that clearly. She was simply doing the social arithmetic she had been taught to do, and the result of the arithmetic was what it was. It is very kind of the Duke, she said, to have employed her. One does feel there is something almost charitable about it. She seems quite genuine, of course. And one imagines the situation in London has not been easy, so it is generous, I think. The word charitable settled over the table the way a stone settles into water, without drama, at the precise depth it was aimed at. Miss Ashwell was looking at her plate. She had heard it. The quality of her stillness was the particular quality of a person who has heard a specific word before, in many rooms, and has learned, because they have had to learn, to absorb its weight without reacting to it visibly. Charitable. The suggestion that what she was doing here was not competence acknowledged but benevolence extended. That the consulting engagement was a kindness rather than a transaction. That she was here on sufferance, not on merit. That the Duke's decision to call her had been an act of generosity toward an unfortunate, rather than the correct decision of a man who needed the best person available and had found her. She was not going to respond to it. She was practiced in the discipline of not responding. The Duke set his fork down. It was not a loud sound. It was the clean, quiet, decisive sound of silver against the plate, and in the particular silence that followed, the social silence that a room produces when it registers that something is happening, it was sufficient. "Miss Ashwell," he said. He said it to the table, and to her, to the room's attention and to her face together, with the economy of a man who intends to say one thing and knows it will be heard by everyone present, and has made that calculation in advance and does not object to it. Miss Ashwell diagnosed the failure of the Harwick South Orchard. 5 consultants, including a professor of established reputation from Edinburgh, could not. She identified a drainage collapse 2 or 3 years old that 5 trained experts missed because they were looking at the surface rather than the foundation. She corrected the treatment of my mother's conservatory collection, 300 specimens, 30 years of cultivation, by finding a structural gap in a glass panel that had escaped notice for 18 months and had been causing irreversible damage every morning in the hours before the house woke. She has directed the remediation of the estate's primary drainage system, and the first confirmed data from that remediation indicates, as of this afternoon, that the orchard can be saved. He said it all in the same even, deliberate voice, not raised, not heated, but with the absolute certainty of a man who is not presenting an argument so much as reading from a document that has already been written and settled. She was not employed out of charity. She was not employed out of generosity. She was employed because she is the most capable person I could find for the work that needed doing, and because every reputable male consultant I tried before her had failed to find what she found in 3 days. He picked up his fork. "I will ask that the word charitable not be applied to the engagement again." The table was very still. Lady Renshaw produced a recovery smile, the social-grade smile she kept for moments of recalibration, and said something about the orchards being quite remarkable, such a complicated business. One had no idea. Mr. Cartwright cleared his throat and agreed with unexpected sincerity that he had in fact no idea about orchards. Lady Dunmore's daughter looked at her soup with the expression of a genuinely kind person who understands that she has said something wrong and is absorbing the lesson. The dinner reassembled itself around fresh conversation, the way a surface reassembles after a stone. I looked at Miss Ashwell. She was looking at the Duke. He had returned to his dinner and was not looking at her. He was cutting his meat with the precise movements of a man who has said what he needed to say and considers the matter resolved and has moved on to the next item. But she was looking at him with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not gratitude, which would have been the small version of it, and not surprise, though there was something in it that registered the unexpectedness of the thing. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for a very long time, in many rooms, and who has just had someone reach over and take the weight from them. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just plainly and completely. And who is in the first moment of understanding what that feels like? He glanced up from his plate. Their eyes met across the candle-lit table for a brief, unhurried moment. Then she looked back at her dinner and he looked back at his, and the evening continued. I returned to my own plate and wrote nothing in the official ledger that night about the quality of that glance. Some entries belong in the other kind of record. The guests departed on the 29th. Lady Renshaw's coach was the last to turn out of the drive, and I watched it from the library window with an equanimity I had worked for and achieved. Miss Ashwell's trunk had been packed since the morning. Her father's leather case was in the hall. She had engaged the hired coach to Cheltenham for 11 o'clock. At 8, she was in the conservatory. She had told me she wanted to do one final check of the Cattleya before leaving the written instructions for pots. I found the Duke there at 8:30, and I found myself, by the convergence of a planting record that had been left on the potting table again, which I had genuinely meant to retrieve several times and had not, standing in the doorway. He came in without announcing himself. She was at the south bench, writing in her notebook, making the final temperature and growth readings for the morning check. She heard him this time. She turned, her pencil still in hand. "The final instructions for pots," she said. "I was just finishing them. They are on the table." He crossed to the bench and stood across from her. He did not look at the instructions. He looked at her. "The hired coach," he said. "It is engaged for 11. "Yes. You will be in London by Thursday. By Wednesday, if the roads are dry." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father's correspondence," he said. "His current files, the plant pathology cases that were in progress when he died. You said there were 11 still open." She looked at him carefully. "Yes. You are going back to close them. To continue them, most of them. Some of them I can resolve. The others," she paused. "The others I will need to pursue as he was pursuing them. It will take time." "And London," he said. "The consulting rooms that refused you." "I will try again," she said. Not with bravado, simply with the flatness of a woman who knows the arithmetic and has decided to attempt the sum anyway. He looked at her. Something had happened to the quality of his stillness. It had changed in the way the conservatory had changed when the northwest panel was sealed. The cold thing stopped, and what remained was warmer than before. "Miss Ashwell," he said, "I will be direct with you, because it is the only manner in which I am competent to conduct this kind of conversation." He paused. "Harwick Hall requires a long-term botanical and drainage consultant. This is true. The South Orchard will need monitoring across the full growing season and probably into the next. The conservatory protocol requires quarterly adjustment until the collection is fully stabilized. There is the lower pasture drainage question, which is not resolved. These are all genuine requirements of the estate." He paused again. "They are not, however, the reason I am standing here." She set her pencil down, very carefully, on the potting table. "The reason I am standing here," he said, "is that Harwick Hall is different since you arrived in it. My mother's orchids are growing again. The men on the farm crew have learned something about soil chemistry that they will use for the next 20 years. Potts sealed a panel gap that had been killing 300 orchid specimens and did not know it, and you told him it was not his fault, and he is a better steward of this house for having worked alongside you for 5 weeks. He stopped. "And I have found myself," he stopped again, and the rarity of the Duke of Harwick searching for words was such that I found I was holding my breath. "I have sat in that library twice this week, with the intention of reviewing the quarterly accounts, and found myself reading instead. I have been in this conservatory more in the past 5 weeks than in the previous 3 years. I have found, to my considerable confusion, that I have become interested in the outcome of the Eastfield drainage gradient in a way that has nothing to do with the orchards." He looked at her steadily. "I think you understand what I am saying." Miss Ashwell looked at him across the bench with his mother's orchids between them, new growth at the base of the stems, the morning light coming in through the sealed northwest panel, even and warm. "You are saying it plainly," she said, "which is what you said you would do." "Yes." A silence. Outside, the Gloucestershire march was soft and gray through the glasshouse glass. "I am not a simple addition to a house," she said at last. "I will have opinions about the estate management that may not align with your agents. I will spend time in the orchards in weather that is not suitable for it and come back with muddy boots. I will read in the evenings instead of being decorative in the drawing room. I will borrow lenses." "Miss Ashwell," he said, with a quality in his voice that was the warmth he kept at the greatest distance from the world, plainly visible for once, "I have been watching you for 5 weeks. I am not asking for a decorative addition to this house. I am asking you to be in it, as yourself, as you have been." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to unmake it. "The northwest panel," she said, "will need rechecking in October. The putty should hold, but the frame may shift again with the autumn temperature variance." "Then you will be here in October," he said. "And the cattleya will need the watering schedule adjusted in July, when the glass house temperature peaks." "Then you will be here in July." She looked down at the cattleya on the bench between them, the large one, his mother's original cutting, with the ivory label in his mother's hand. At the base of the stem, the new growth was very clearly visible now, green and precise and alive. "Yes," she said. "I will be here." He reached across the bench and took her hand, her right hand, with the small scar on the index finger from an old pruning knife, the hand that had pressed itself to cold bark and smelled the wood, and found the cold in the glass before the house was awake. He held it with the kind of care that a man applies to things he intends to keep. The hired coach went back to Cheltenham without her. I updated the estate accounts that afternoon. Under the entry for the consulting engagement of Miss Nora Ashwell I wrote, "Engagement extended indefinitely. Orchards recovering on schedule. Conservatory collection stabilizing. New growth confirmed across 14 cattleya specimens." I reviewed this entry, found it accurate, and added one additional line. "Miss Ashwell will remain at Harwick Hall." She is still here. The orchards came fully right by August, not partially, not provisionally, but right. The infected trees cleared, the healthy ones recovered, the new growth along the south ridge visible from the gate in the early morning in a way that I understand Potts found it necessary to go and look at several times in the first week it appeared, which I understand because I did the same. The east field gradient held. The lower pasture drainage project, which she had identified in her original report as a long-term risk, was completed in June under her direction, and the cattle in the lower field have remained in their correct position ever since. The conservatory bloomed in September. All 300 specimens, his mother's 30 years of cultivation, produced for the first time in 4 years. Potts, who had worked the Harwick grounds for 22 years and considered most external advice an intrusion, came to find me on the morning the first cattleya opened and told me to come and look. We stood in the conservatory together in the September light and looked at the south bench and did not say anything for a long time, which was the correct response. The Duke married her in November. The chapel is at the south end of the estate, at the edge of the orchard, and the November light came through the windows in long, clear, honest lines across the stone floor. The apple trees were bare along the ridge, standing in their correct winter quiet, and I could see them through the east window when I turned. She walked in wearing a deep green dress, not new, but good, and very much the right color, and she carried a small bunch of late cattleya from the conservatory, which had been Potts's doing, arranged that morning with a care that he would not have admitted to if asked. The Duke was at the front of the chapel. He was still, in the way that is different from the stillness of a man who has shut the world out and more like the stillness of a man who has let something in and found, as a consequence, that he no longer needs to hold himself in the particular careful tension that keeping the world at a distance requires. He watched her walk down the aisle, and his face was the face of a man who has found, late and without anticipating it, the thing that makes the accounts make sense. There were no grand speeches. There were no sneering guests to humble. There was no dramatic moment for the room to gasp at. There was only the November light, and the bare orchard through the east window, and two people making a quiet and irrevocable decision in the sight of the small number of people who were there because they were meant to be. Lady Renshaw was not invited. I recorded this in my private ledger with a satisfaction I do not apologize for. What I will say, as the man who had the account of all of it from beginning to end, is this. Every table in London had called her useless. Every consulting room had looked at a botanist's daughter with her father's lens and her father's methodology, precise, unconventional, demonstrably correct, and found the shape of her wrong. They had offered the word charitable as if it were generous and wielded it as if it were not a blade, and she had absorbed it, room after room, with the composure of a woman who has learned that composure is the only defense that costs her nothing she cannot afford to lose. She came to Harwick Hall in a hired coach with one trunk and her father's worn leather case, and she crouched in the mud of the south orchard in the February drizzle, and smelled the wood of a dying apple tree, and she found what 5 trained experts had not found because she knew where to look and was not concerned with whether anyone was watching her look. She sealed a panel gap that had been killing 300 orchid specimens for 18 months. She saved the estate. She read his mother's letters and her mother's labels and understood both of them, and she stood in the conservatory with his mother's lens and showed him the new growth at the base of the old stem, and he looked at it, and at her, and understood something that he had not, until that moment, known he needed to understand. The orchards are producing again. The conservatory is full of his mother's blooms. The accounts of Harwick Hall, which had been moving steadily toward a reckoning for 3 years, are balanced. And the house is right, in the way that a house is right when the person who was always meant to be in it has finally arrived, and everyone in it, from the Duke at the library table, to Potts in the conservatory, to young Croft in the south orchard who now understands soil chemistry, has adjusted to the new weight of her presence and found the house steadier for it. I close this entry here. The accounts are kept. The ledger is balanced. She is here. Edmund Hale, Estate Steward, Harwick Hall, Gloucestershire. December 1847.